Welcome to the Crafting Strategy webinar series dedicated to managing through the brewery expansion process. Our members have requested this year some more interactive content. As much as possible, we do that in person, but we're trying out a new technology from Zoom today, so we'd really like to thank our attendees and our panelists for being here. I've personally presented with our domain experts, Mark Moore and Brian Grafton of FMD Architects. They are brewery and winery domain experts. We've presented together on several occasions. Brian has also taken our University of Portland online certificate course in beer business strategy. These guys really know what they're doing. They're building based at Akron, Ohio, but have a national footprint. And like me, they prefer to listen to the brewers first. And so really, I'm going to be MC of this conversation. It's going to be led by our two brewing members that are sharing their current expansions. Baerlic Brewing and Migration Brewing. And, really this is kind of how I like to run my MBA classrooms, and Mark Meckler likes to run his classroom, which is let the students take the lead and we'll be here to support. So regarding expansion means two different things to different brewing entrepreneurs. And today we'll listen to two very successful growing craft breweries in the tough Portland market, implementing two very different expansions. And so I'm going to start with Ben Parsons. So Ben, thanks so much for being here. I recall about 12 months ago hearing about your expansion. I'm going to put a couple pictures on the screen here while I'm introducing you. 1 second. Hold on, I'm working on the technology here. So Ethos Development is your partner. Here's the Barley Pod. Can you talk a little bit about the development? And over the last 12 months, I've been really impressed with the innovative way to self-distribute your own beer to a second location. And talk about how that's gone and update us a little bit on the project.
Yeah, so I'd say probably January of last year, 2017, we were kind of thinking about what our next step was going to be. We've been pretty successful with our current tap room, which is off of our production brew space. And it's been pretty successful, and we've seen year-over-year growth. So we opted to kind of stay in that self-distributed, smaller wholesale model and really think about what we could do with retail. So originally we were kind of spitballing ideas. Do we go all in with a second tap room, brick and mortar? There's a lot of food cart pods around here. So we started looking at even opening up a beer cart. Kind of holding the only liquor license on a lot. And then through a couple of acquaintances, we met Josh and Paul at Ethos, and they had this idea. They had this property. They wanted to have a bar as the anchor tenant and then a food cart pod wrapped around it. So that's kind of where the idea stemmed from. It's been a really collective thing creatively from those guys and us kind of massaging it to what it is now. But unfortunately, we've had plenty of time to do that. We've been delayed for most of the last year. Starting in probably June, late May, getting into permitting issues with the city of Portland. So it's been one thing after another. I won't bore you with all the details, but comes down to, at the end of the day, we were delayed about 8 months on getting started, and we just are hitting the ground, getting it opened up and starting to build out right now, and hope to be open by summer.
Wonderful. Thanks for that update. Before we go over to McKean, Ben, do you have any specific questions for the architects at this time that not just benefit you, but could benefit the people listening?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I talked to a lot of other brewery owners, and of course, being gone through the process myself, it seems like, at least in Portland, and I'm sure lots of other places, it's really hard to estimate how long and how much opening a brewery or production brewery, small brewery, tap room, brew pub, how long that's going to take. So I guess my question for them is, how do they manage their clients' expectations on that kind of, the scope creep and just kind of that snowballing kind of nature of a startup?
Well, one of the first things that we really do is ask our client when they want to be in. That's the number one thing. What is their goal? And basically we tell them, if you want to be in about a year from now, you need to start right away, or you should have already started. So you heard that 1 year time frame, And that's because you've got design time, different elements that you want to make sure things get properly put on paper, and take your time doing that. But really the part that we don't control very well is the fact that once you submit to the agencies, all the different agencies, we're at their mercy. Now, they are absolutely supposed to review our sets of plans in 30 days, but you can count on an adjudication or a letter of correction, if you will, coming back from them, because every time you submit, especially a new brewery and you're the first one in a jurisdiction, that building department, they have no idea how to handle a brewery. They think it's a full-blown restaurant, so they want to add things. I mean, the majority of our clients, we try to tell them up front, don't be surprised if they want a grease interceptor or something, even though you might not even be serving food. So we start to lose control when we go through all these agencies, and then that trickles out a couple, 2 to 3 months, as well as architectural review boards, planning and zoning. So we want to make sure that you're given it plenty of time. And then when the construction starts, we all know that many things can happen, and those delays during construction now extend your project out another 2 to 3 months. So we say, okay, if you wanted to really open in next February, start telling your clients or people that you're around that it's realistically going to be April. And great, if you open up and have the opportunity to open up beforehand, it goes so much smoother. It's easier to justify to everybody, and they're happy that you're ahead of schedule. But it gets awkward month after month when you have to delay from February to March to April to May, and then they're wondering what's going wrong with the whole system.
And I was going to jump in on, you mentioned scope creep as well in the question. So, you know, it's difficult for people to take the answer no. And I know in one of the conversations, I think you expressed a similar sentiment. The challenge is that, you know, as architects, we're designing for your budget, for your vision, and sometimes it takes just a little bit of finagling to get things phased in or brought in a sense that, you know, I have this amount of money and I want this much project. How can we do that? So that's where we kind of will say, well, what about taking some steps and working up to that? Or, you know, what can we design in a different manner in order to incorporate those things? But a lot of it's just a back and forth balancing game that really comes down to just how well developed your trust is in the relationship with your architect and your builder.
So thank you guys. Ben, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was thinking, at what point do you guys consider the best for architecture to get involved in a project? Is that kind of after a building is found or before?
We like to tell everybody, we speak in many different conferences and things, and we tell them as soon as you're starting to think about a project and you're going to look at your first site or a few sites or even buildings, we want to be involved in there. We can help you negotiate and leases, or even we give you heads up on things that you might be not aware of on this site that you want to do some due diligence on. So we want to get involved as early as you guys will allow us to. And it's not a big upfront cost thing there. That's not why we're trying to do that. We generally don't even get into cost until we start doing some schematics with you and everything. But we feel that we will save you so much money by being on board early to tell you, hey, that building looks like it's got asbestos, and that's going to take more than what you expected in your budget to do this, or, you know, this building or this property doesn't have the proper amount of utilities, the incoming water service or electric that you're going to need. And now that changes your whole scope. Plus the lenders absolutely love us on board because we're working with you on cost to try to confirm what you're putting in your business plan, so that when you're asking for money, you know, we're all on the same page up front.
I can give a concrete example. So I've presented both with FMD and with lenders at conferences, and I had a crafting and strategy member on Guam reach out. These were very experienced restaurant operators. They had an existing building that had previously housed a restaurant, and their initial schematic looked really exciting to me, but I could tell right away that the ceiling height was going to be a problem. And it's, it's one thing for Sam to say the ceiling height's a problem, but I wasn't quite articulating things as well as I could. And I reached out to Brian and Mark, and Brian immediately said, well, once you stick a grain mill on top of that brew house, and if you want to auger to it, there's absolutely no way that it's going to work. And then they got into all of these other scenarios. Brian, you could probably do a better job describing, but really within, I don't know, a 15 to 45 minute phone call, I think we saved these guys at least $100,000 in mistakes and rework. They didn't even get charged for it. At that point, it was, let us communicate our expertise, let Sam help communicate the value of crafting a strategy. And, ultimately, I believe, Brian, you guys did end up working together beyond that, but the initial call was just, yeah, you guys need to hit stop on this for a little bit. Could you elaborate it for a second, Brian?
Sure. So when we first met the team that's out there in Guam, we had a few photos and we had initial sketches that they wanted. And, as Sam mentioned, they had some big visions. They were talking about, starting off at, for startup, 7-barrel, 10-barrel, or 15-barrel. And they wanted to put it on the second floor. But once we started crunching some numbers, look at the grist case, it wasn't really going to work, structurally speaking and headroom speaking. So within 30 days of that relationship, we were able to work with them across internationally to give them a concept that they could take and work directly with their local architect on. And after that, they were on their way, and they felt much more confident, and their investors felt much more confident knowing that, the expertise and the thought went through in the actual layout, and not just buying the building and trying to jam equipment into it and hoping for the best.
Thank you very much. Ben, anything else before I give McKean a chance to update us on his project?
Yeah, I would say from a personal perspective, I think, trying to partner with professional services architecture, specifically people who really understand breweries, because they're a pretty unique beast of a startup. So I think having your architect know what a grist case is pretty important.
Wonderful. Okay, McKean, I'm going to shift over to you. Thanks again for joining us. So I should tell the other listeners that I have a personal connection to both these projects. They're both an easy walk from my house when I moved back to Oregon, so I'm really excited. Actually, I can walk to McKean's current facility pretty easily, and I often take my kids there and sit outside on his great patio. And so, McKean, you guys decided to locate in Gresham, Oregon, which is currently, I think it's safe to say, underserved by craft
Correct.
breweries.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got a building that was not necessarily purpose-built, but it's a large building. Can you give us a few of the basic specs of the building itself and the kind of equipment you're putting in there, and give us an update?
Absolutely. So in November of 2017, we signed a 10-year lease for a 20,000 square foot space off 181st and Wilkes Road. So if you're going out I-84, for those that are familiar with our area, exit 13, it's about 10 minutes from the current location. We're going to have a large-scale production facility there running on a 20-barrel system, as well as we are putting in a 3,000 square foot pub, a brew pub. So right now, the current projected opening date is early June, shooting for June 1st. We're doing collaborations with people like Baerlic and some other people in the industry that we have good relationships with to have some unique beers on tap for that opening. But we are hoping that the pub and the production facility open at the same time. Of course, it'll take a little bit of basically time into the summer to get our own beers produced out there and online. But that's the quick update. Things are moving fast. We've been very happy with City of Gresham. Some of the things Ben mentioned regarding the City of Portland, we dealt with on a small scale, and that was one of the reasons why we were looking to get outside the jurisdiction of Portland, just mainly to try to get things going through the city faster. From a permitting standpoint, City of Gresham was very excited to have our business think about locating out there. We ended up in an economic redevelopment zone, so there's some financial incentives there as well. And honestly, it's very refreshing to be entering a community that sees you as being unique and puts value on us making that leap of faith into the area. And I'm sure Ben can speak to it, and Sam, the Portland beer market is it's becoming extremely competitive, and there's a lot of breweries in town. And when you go down to the city, it actually kind of differs a little bit from what FMD was saying. I think the city of Portland is actually pretty familiar with the brewery model, but they are making it challenging to get things open. I think right now average brewery time in Portland is probably 1.5 to 2 years to get open, which is I think is a very big challenge. That was part of the deal. And honestly, when we think about the history of craft breweries, a lot of them have done well going in the underserved neighborhoods where the rent's cheaper, where you can get more space. And for us, being a catalyst for community development has always been a focus. And we think that there's a lot of upside coming into a community such as Gresham. We're not just in Gresham, we're in Rockwood. So Rockwood is, definitely from an economic standpoint is probably one of the poorest areas in this area right now. So we're really excited about being involved with that community, and I think that's been reciprocated from the city of Gresham thus far. So we're excited about it.
That's great, McKean. My wife actually teaches in Rockwood. It's a community that deserves a lot of happiness and a lot of love for sure. And I think your business is gonna help with that. To the attendees out there, we're getting your questions. They're really good. I'm going to give McKean a chance to ask some questions specific to his project, and then I will start asking your questions. So keep them coming. We are getting them. We're screening them, and we'll throw those at the architects and at our brewers here in a second. So McKean, thanks again for that update. Do you have some specific questions you'd like to ask our architect domain experts?
Yeah, absolutely. I have two questions, and these have really come out of our current project. With a larger system like this, we're wondering, does it make sense if we do this again? Does it make sense to bring in a mechanical engineer to more or less quarterback all of the the different pieces of the production facility? While we were relatively successful setting up a 7-barrel at our current location, going to the larger system, more square footage, trying to make the space dynamic for growth. There's been a significant amount of scope gaps that the vendors do their best to bid around, but by the time we actually get to it, we've had some significant scope gaps that have required some creative thinking as well as additional financing. So the specific question is, for the architects, have you worked with mechanical engineers, and do you believe that the additional cost that they require is offset by the value they bring to the project?
So we have worked with mechanical engineers on several large facilities. In fact, going to 15-barrel systems and up. The key with working with the mechanical engineer is obviously going to be having somebody to kind of keep them in check, and that comes with experience in doing facilities like this. For all those mechanical engineers joining the call, I don't want to necessarily turn down what you do, but a lot of times it's easy to get into a routine of opening the book. I've got this much square footage. I need this much equipment. Here's your several ton, chiller and HVAC system. And, as brewers, we know let the space get a little uncomfortable. Let it swing up to 70s and 80s, depending on, if you've got the ventilation needs. And so a lot of times we keep them in check and keep them on point to make sure that they're not providing really more than is needed. So no humidity control system if you don't mind sweating it out a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the newer trends, actually, we were approached recently about this. Somebody wanted to try to do energy recovery for a sustainability initiative. So then, obviously you're going to need to involve somebody in there familiar with those, systems. And, mm-hmm. But it really comes down to having somebody check them and keep them in balance.
So do you think that they are effective at eliminating some of those scope gaps, so that at least you have a very accurate financial picture or budget in place for the project?
Yes, especially if you include them with the process piping. A lot of times those will get bid out and process piping gets excluded. For ours, we almost exclusively always ask that as a line item that a owner or brewer can say, yes, I want that included. No, my vendor's going to take care of that. But we've seen that occur where they didn't want to include it, and somebody's scratching their head wondering where my process piping is, and
Right.
how do I get glycol here? So including it in the front end and balancing that in your overall equation has been tremendously helpful when developing larger and larger facilities where
Right.
it's not just a few feet of piping; it's sometimes miles.
No, correct. I mean, I'll be full transparency. We came across a bit of a scope gap on just what you're talking about, some of the chiller piping and whatnot, and it's a big ticket item. Running all those drops and we had to change units mid project, which then threw off some of the original bids, and we had to bring a vendor in, which we've been very happy with now, but it was an unforeseen cost. And so, as we move forward, if we do this again, we've been told by our GC that a mechanical engineer can provide a lot of value for these types of projects.
Yeah,
Okay.
we
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, we absolutely try to educate the clients with, you're going to see that upfront cost.
Yeah.
And you're going to go, wow, do I really need that kind of stuff? But you just said it to everybody that's listening. The savings, the cost that's up front is X amount. It's usually about 3 times the savings of scope gap and
Right.
the things that you're trying to deal with. And more importantly, it's not even just scope gap. It's now you have to improvise on how you're going to route things and, spaces that you might not have planned for. There's so many other things that can happen as soon as there's a miss in something. So on expansions or the larger scales, we certainly encourage them. We don't always get them, but we encourage them. On the smaller projects, we understand that everybody on startups, so a lot of times they don't have that budget. So we with our experience, work with them and then maybe a local contractor and try to close that gap as well.
Well, that's great. That actually leads into my second question, assuming I have time to ask
Yes,
this.
please.
Architectural fees, design fees, engineering fees, in my experience thus far, have been they're pretty close to impossible to finance through banks. And with these larger projects, the design fees are quite substantial. I never got a bid from a mechanical engineer, but let's just assume that they're somewhat in the ballpark range of what it takes to bring an architect on. In your experience, have you guys seen any creative ways to get those costs, wrapped into more hard costs so they can be financed better? Because it's very easy to get into 6-figure cash outlays for design, which we all know is very important, particularly early on in the project. But there can be some, as you mentioned, startups may have a tough time, affording that.
McKean, let me jump in before the answer. We're in a future podcast, we're going to actually bring on some bankers.
Oh, cool.
I think the short answer is most traditional banks or community banks don't understand the beer industry well enough to be able to lend on fees like that. But they are, at least to my understanding, and Mark and Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they are allowed under some SBA loans. The 7A, I believe, allows that. But again, you really need a bank that understands the role that architecture plays in a brewery more than it might play on a different kind of building. But we are definitely going to dedicate some time to that in a future webinar. So, but do you guys, for Mark and Brian, did I get it close enough to right? And B, do you have any comments to add at this time?
Yeah, you did very well at explaining it. Yes, the SBA 7A loan typically covers it. We've never had any problems. If you're not going SBA or you're going SBA 504, now it gets a little bit more tricky. But just like your architects that have experience in breweries, we also encourage you to go for lenders and builders that have experience, because the lenders that do have those creative ways. And when they don't, and then that challenges us for sure, and that's where we get into what can we roll under design build with the contractor, and that's how you get that stuff incorporated a little bit. But again, I like Sam said, I think we're going to have a whole session on that in our financing webinar coming up here in the next couple months.
Great.
And McKean, just to wrap up on that one, I think there are certain banks out there that may subordinate to your existing bank. So if somebody wanted to make a midstream change,
Right.
Whether you roll it in with the contractor and that financing, or you let somebody take a second position with the current bank. But again, I don't want to say something that could be less than accurate. So we're going to bring that up again in a later webinar, if that's okay.
Sounds great to me.
Okay, well, we're going to take our first question from the attendees. This is from Mark. Mark's working with a brewer who's talking to a developer. This is a question for FMD, and then certainly Ben and McKean can jump in if you have some expertise to share. The developer's wondering what's the basic structure his development group has to provide as a lessor to make it appropriate for a brewer to lease and run a brewery and tasting room in a 10 to 20 barrel brewery. So I guess this is, sort of thinking about the permitting process down the road and working with the municipal folks. Can you give some basics, architects would look for to help a brewer or a developer in this situation?
Sure. To begin with, it is going to be dependent on how long they plan to be in the space. 10 to 20 barrels is big or larger, I guess, and say they're not going to be there for 3 to 5 years. But, again, if they're not going to be there for long term, it doesn't make as much sense to invest a lot into basic structure, being slab improvements and, certain floor coatings, so on and so forth. But let's assume it's, in McKean's case, a 10-year lease or more, with first right of refusal. They'll be there for a while. The big things that you're going to need are basically a floor that can support the weight of the equipment. Traditional 4-inch slabs, when you get to that scale, are just going to not make as long of a life as, going to 6-inch, 8-inch slabs. And again, very dependent on the design of the equipment and the weight of equipment, size of the feet and so on. But also think about operation standpoint as well. So pretty much, you think brewery, you think trench drain next. And a lot of times those are just, the floor is flat and you end up squeegeeing a lot of, cleaning liquids or any, forbidden spills there. So that's a lot of a operational issue as well. So you think about, okay, how much floor can I do? How much do I need to slope and get it to this trench drain? And that's still at ground level. We haven't even moved up yet. Once you're thinking, we talked a little bit about mechanical. What are you putting on the ceiling? Do you need any mechanical systems to pull air out? How are you getting your equipment in? Are you going through a roof hatch like we've seen here in Ohio and Northeast Ohio up in Cleveland area? Or are you going to accommodate some, 8x10, 10x10 garage doors that you can cradle that equipment in and have the ability to move it in the future as well, not to limit yourself and basically build the building around, that equipment. So those are a couple of the key things, I guess, spatially. And then other things would be just utilities. So are you working on 3-phase power? Do you have a big enough water line there? Depending on how long you want to sit and wait for your water tank to fill, or, just get that 2-inch, 3-inch line in there. Those are big things to consider as well. And a lot of that, again, will tie into what equipment you're using. Not a lot of people are doing direct fire, so I don't touch too much on gas, but on the electrical and steam side, certainly a lot.
All right, so we've got a few minutes left. You guys have done a really good job staying on time. Ben, I have a question to throw at you, and I'm going to share my screen here and take a look at the barley pod, because I get asked a lot about relationships with food cart vendors, and how do you structure these? Do they pay a fee? What sort of terms are there, or do you just kind of make space and then schedule them? If I look at your picture here, and I hope people on the screen can see it, you've got an awesome space here with several carts, actually, more than 5, I think. So can you talk a little bit about your experience in, partnering with these really critical folks to the atmosphere of your tap room?
Yeah, for us, that partnership is really big. We've done really good at hospitality in our current tap room, and to think that we might, we're taking on added risk by adding 6 to 8 other kind of hospitality like businesses under our umbrella. So, I think for us, we're trying to find carts that have this is not their first cart. They're experienced. They have maybe a following. I think. Because of the lower buy-in for food carts, I think you can get a lot more experience in those and all the things that can come along with that. So I think really finding experienced vendors and then really managing expectations. I mean, one thing we built into the lease structure is kind of a good neighbor agreement or a good partner agreement that we're all in this together, and this is a shared concept. So when it comes to there's a lot of unknowns about what sort of things are going to come up, with that collective space. But we all kind of have to be in it to win it. And as far as a lease structure, typically they're anywhere from 6 months to a year, which is pretty short comparatively when you think about breweries or brew pubs. And they do pay kind of a lease per month plus a portion of the utilities, portion of the maintenance, things like that. So it's the way we've built it because we are having a standalone building. We've kind of had to massage the different utilities in different ways. So they'll have a bigger impact on wastewater and grease interceptor, things like that. So they'll pay a little more in that wastewater management, and we'll pay a little more in electricity because we have the interior of the space, things like that. So we've kind of divided that pie up in a lot of different ways with the intent to make it as fair as possible, because really at the end of the day, we're all in this together, and the more people we can bring in with great experience with food, the more beer we sell, and everybody wins at that.
Thank you very much. One other thing to add, I know in Oregon at least, and in several other states, the rules for sort of what the food carts need to have nearby, from bathroom to a place to wash dishes, they really do vary by county. And so it's really important for any entrepreneurs looking to start one of these cool partnerships to really understand the rules and issues before you go out. Because if you don't have anything in, as we've learned today, if you make some of these mistakes and try to correct them later, it only gets more expensive.
Yeah. Just another layer in that municipality.
Sam, can I jump in real quick on that as well? We have several clients, and they have food trucks, and just even the way they line up and the areas that you have fenced off for outside activities, and the trucks to line up against them so that you can carry around your beer and also get to the food trucks. Many other elements come into your master planning when you're starting that design that you want to think about as well. Just little things like that I wanted to bring up and to everyone's attention.
Okay, thank you very much. So Ben, I know you had a couple questions kind of directed at me about crafting a strategy about brewing entrepreneurs. Why don't we close with fire away with that, and then we'll advertise a little bit on our upcoming webinar next month.
Yeah, I'm always kind of curious to get in the heads of brewery owners, because there's just so many different scales. There's from 2-barrel nanos to regional breweries, everything in between, food, no food, retail, wholesale, distribution. I'm always curious what kind of skill set or backgrounds make for a successful brewery owner. Typically speaking, as a passion industry, a lot of people who don't have experience running businesses or breweries are getting into the industry. I'm curious what works.
I spend most of my time talking to brewery owners. I meet folks from all backgrounds. I think number one is to be a lifelong learner. I think especially as your brewery grows, if you get into this loving to make beer, you're going to actually make less and less of it, and you have to be okay with that. I think, in terms of the best skill set that I see, and this really goes, I've studied entrepreneurship outside the beer industry too. Humility, I think, is number one. Realizing that you can't do it alone, that you need to surround yourself with not just employees and partners, but even when selecting investors, don't just take the first money that shows up, right? Take money that is also going to add value in terms of expertise when at all possible. I can't tell you the number of times investors they'll say something as innocuous as, "Hey, why isn't your beer at Trader Joe's?" And your answer is, well, there could be a lot of reasons. Number one, their price points are potentially lower than a place like Whole Foods. Number two, they don't refrigerate all of their beer, and I really like to make sure my beer is refrigerated. And what happens is, if your investor group grows and there's people that only are contributing money and questions, that takes your bandwidth and takes your eye off the ball for running the day-to-day brewery. So if possible, I would look for that in your investor group. I think the other thing is, communities like Crafting a Strategy, where we get together and talk about business ideas, just like we're doing today. And even if there's a brewery down the street that's doing something cool, I have yet to meet a single owner that won't sit down and have a beer and be, basically an open book. So don't be afraid to ask, be humble. And I think the other thing that's really good, especially for people that are running a retail operation that's food related, ask your staff. I think they're in the front lines. They're truly interacting with your consumers, probably at the level you wish you could. And they've got a lot of knowledge too. And I think sometimes we're so concerned with motivating them and setting up incentive plans and setting up retirement plans that sometimes we don't necessarily bring them into the equation and ask them, what do they think we should do? So that would be a somewhat brief answer to that question.
Yeah, I think your point about getting buy-in from your staff, I think, as far as we've kind of grown over the last 4 years, I've gotten further and further away from actually making the beer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just now I'm starting to learn things, from to like what beer our accounts are in. I'll send a lead to our sales guy, and he's like, yeah, we delivered a keg there last week. So like being able to close that gap, I think is really important with your staff as you grow.
I think so as well. So we're up against the clock here. Thank you very much. We had a couple dozen people join us here for the webinar. So first of all, thank you to the attendees. Also, thank you to the panelists. It's been great to see the updates and listen to what you're up to. We've got at least five more of these webinars related to architecture and expansion. Our next topic is going to be related to sort of non-beer producing revenue sources like event spaces and venues. We'll be in touch with our membership in about a week or so once we get on everybody's schedule to schedule the exact date and time for that one. And also a big thanks to our domain experts, Mark and Brian at FMD Architects. Brian and Mark, any final words to the panelists or to the audience before we wrap this up?
It was a pleasure to be on the call. And if you have any questions, we always welcome a conversation. And we always say kind of questions are free and mistakes are expensive. Ask away. So.
Wonderful. McKean, any final words of wisdom?
Final words of wisdom, huh?
I'm putting you on the spot here.
I know. I thought I was already checked out, man. All right. I'm a firm believer in passion. And, when you're an entrepreneur that's passionate about what you're doing, I believe there's always a way. And if you surround yourself with other people that are as equally passionate about either what you're doing or their own skills and services that can, help be a team member for your organization, then I really do think the sky's the limit. So words of wisdom, surround your people that are passionate about what they do, and just be passionate about what you're doing, and I think you can accomplish whatever you set your mind to.
There's an old saying in entrepreneurship that if you get into this for money, you're in the wrong game because you're going to run out. Absolutely. But if you get into it for love and passion, you're going to find a way to overcome your problems.
Absolutely.
So thanks everybody very much. Great job on this first webinar. Thanks for putting up with our technology to the attendees, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.